let me get started. And then I think as folks stream in, my part is the least important anyway. I want to shine a light on Jessica and Rohit. And so let me get things going. Cool. So welcome everybody. This is the fourth edition of our Silsila webinar series. And I always go through this slide just to kind of reaffirm what this is all about. And it's really about trying to create a community for engineers and builders to learn about MCP first and foremost, and also agent development secondly. We want to try to like break through the noise and really focus on the next level of detail when it comes to building AI applications. There's a lot of kind of, in my opinion, a lot of noise out there on what to focus on. It's really hard to kind of pick and understand what is worth spending your time investing in and what isn't. And so we're hoping to like just have a casual discussion amongst engineers and see what the cool stuff that people are building. And also, this is meant to be shining a spotlight on you. It's not really about an ad for any particular product or company, but we'll talk about cool products and cool companies, but mostly from the perspective of people who are building MCP and agents and operating in that space, and really the innovations that are happening. Also, Silsila means chain of events in Urdu, and so I think that's why like it's a nice name for this kind of an event where we're trying to bring together researchers, developers, and we're trying to build agents that are powered by MCP. So today our theme is very important. It's about agent identity and auth. That's kind of the overarching theme that we want to kind of cover. But as part of that, we'll try to show like really good agents, and that would hopefully demonstrate why auth and identity is even important in the context of agents. There's a lot of trust that we put into these autonomous AI systems nowadays, and I want to talk a little bit about what the identity and security aspect of that looks like. Also, what are the best practices around agent identity and auth? That's kind of like a less discussed topic right now, so we should dive a little bit deeper into that. And lastly, maybe a little bit of practical guides on how you enable auth and identity for agents. So we'll kind of cover those themes overall. And I'm super, super excited because we have an amazing group of folks to try to talk about some of that. So first, we'll have Jessica Wang from Warp, who will showcase like what a production grade agent really looks like and what developers are using every day. Many developers are using every day for their daily workflows. Next, we'll have Rohit Ganguly from Descope talk a little bit about what he's been working on. And then I'll just moderate the discussion. Folks know me from previous events, so I'll skip my introduction. But I also want to talk a little bit about how we've implemented OAuth for some of our cloud deployments and for MCP agents. So if there's time at the end, I'll get to that. But let's get started perhaps. So Jessica, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, such a good intro. All right, let's do it. Okay, can everyone see this? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so I don't really have fancy slides. I'm just gonna go straight into a demo, but I have my notes on the left so you can kind of follow along with what I'm doing. So hey, I'm Jess. I'm a developer advocate at Warp. Been there for about 3.5 years now. Um, don't know if anybody has heard of Warp, and I also can't see anybody. But just as some basic context, Warp is what we call an agentic development environment, also cleverly coined as ADE, which is like a play on IDE. Um, I have Warp open on the right. It basically looks like a terminal when you open it up, which kind of makes sense because we actually used to be a terminal product before we kind of pivoted into the AI coding dev tool space. So I can use it like a basic terminal. I can type in ls. I can cd into a specific folder, and you can also see there's like completions and things like that. But that's not what I really want to focus on. I want to focus on agent part of it, the agentic part of Warp. So even though I can use it as a terminal, I can also type in something like, what is this directory? And you can see that I didn't really have to do anything special. Warp actually detects that I was typing in natural language, and it kicks into its agentic mode, basically saying, hey, like, I recognize that this is a English or natural language query, and kind of then triggering like more of the agentic process. So what I want to show in this demo is I'm going to actually kick off 4 workflows, essentially 4 different agents to do 4 different things for me. And we're gonna see if this works. These are things I've done before, like in real life as part of productivity workflows. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to transcribe a video and generate a .srt file. And I do this a lot for my videos because I do a lot of videos for work. So let's start agent number 1. So I'm gonna pull in a video. Let's see. Let's do this one. So I'm in my Finder now. I'm just going to drag and drop my file into Warp. It will put in the file path automatically for me. And I'm going to say, can you transcribe this video into a .srt file and chunk it up for me. I'm just gonna put this above. Hold on. Okay. So, and then I'm also going to use, I want to show off our model picker. So Warp supports a bunch of different models. We just recently put in 4.5 Haiku, which launched, I believe, last week or maybe a week and a half ago. I can't keep up anymore. But I like this one because it's really cheap. You can see here we have our model specs. So I'm going to choose this one just because I don't really care too much about the quality. I just want this to like not cost me a lot of money. So I'm gonna kick this off. Do I need to do anything? No. Okay. So that's number 1. Okay, while that's running, I'm gonna start session or agent number 2. So this one is one I use a lot. I often work in a lot of like new code bases. Sometimes I'm finding new code bases for like demos and stuff like that, or I just want to play around with stuff. So I'm going to summarize a code base. So let's go into my coding projects, and I have this magic 8-ball tool. Um, you don't really need to know that much about it, but essentially it's just like a basic like Python script with like brain trust, which is like a LLM observability tool built in. So I'm actually just gonna say, can you summarize this code base for me? Very simple. Okay, so that's agent number 2. I'll go back to these agents, show you what it's doing, but I'm just going to kick all 4 of these off first. Okay, the next one I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a MCP server. I'm going to use the Figma MCP server to code a web app for me. So I have this Figma file that I pulled from online. It is a random random like I don't really know what this is, like an e-commerce Figma file. I just chose it because I like the little like icons. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy the link to this Figma file and then go back into Warp. And you'll see that I have a couple MCP servers set up already. I have a Figma MCP server running. I also have a GitHub MCP server running, which I'll demo later in the 4th session or the 4th agent. But yeah, Figma MCP server is set up and running. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start my 3rd agent, and I'm actually gonna reference a saved prompt, and I'll show you why in a sec. So I'm gonna press the @ symbol, and then I'll do clone or maybe Figma. Yeah, and I'm going to reference this essentially saved prompt that I have. Now, to show you what this prompt is, I'm actually going to go into my Warp drive and show you what this prompt is. So, sorry, there's a lot of like, it's kind of cluttered UI, but basically it says, okay, you're expert front-end engineer, specialized in building pixel-perfect UIs, blah, blah, blah. Use the Figma MCP server to fetch and parse your design details. And then essentially I have a bunch of stuff here around like, I want it to replicate the UI pixel perfect, fonts, weights, letter spacing, padding, all the stuff. It's good to specify it in your prompt because it may seem like very obvious to you as a human, but I've noticed that the more specific I get with my prompt, the better the output. And I've run this demo many times and I've actually honed this prompt down many times. So yeah, so you can kind of see there's just a bunch of stuff here around what I want this to do. So sorry, I'm just gonna reference that prompt again. Clone, or no, what's it called? Figma. So yeah, so that's when it does this is referencing that saved prompt that I just showed you. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and paste that Figma link in just so it can reference that Figma file. And I'm gonna actually add one more thing, which is let me save this to a new directory called directory called Figma clone 2 because I feel like I already have one set up. Okay. So that's number 4. Sorry, that's number 3. I'm losing track. Okay, we're gonna do number 4 and then I'm gonna show you what everything's doing. Okay. The 4th thing is I use this a lot. I'm gonna use the GitHub MCP server to create GitHub issues from all of my to-dos. So I have a code base with cd share boot files with some to-dos in here. So I'm gonna say, can you use the GitHub MCP server to create GitHub issues from all the to-dos in this code base? Okay, cool. All right, so we have our 4 different agents running, and now I'm going to show you kind of how I optimize things as I work. So the first one is transcribing the video. So this one actually already finished, so I'll show you the results of that. This one is summarizing the code base for me, and I'll actually show you some parts of the Warp UI as it goes. So you'll see that as it executes, it actually kind of pauses at key moments where it's trying to like read files or write to files and ask me for permission first. And yeah, I'm just gonna click run. And usually for something like this, I'm actually gonna go into auto approve mode, which also can be known as like YOLO mode or something like that, where I don't really care about approving everything and I'll just let it run. So this actually ran really quickly because it's a really small code base. It comes up with the summary and actually it flashed on the screen for a bit, but it also created a mermaid diagram for me, which is really cool. I use this a lot when, as I said, I'm just trying to grok new code bases. And you might ask, oh, hey, Jess, you never asked it to create a diagram for you. Like, how did it know to do that? Well, I actually have a rule set up. So if I go into rules, this is kind of, I've optimized this a lot, but I have a rule set up saying every time I ask Warp to summarize a code base, it automatically will generate a mermaid CLI diagram for me, essentially like some sort of architecture diagram. Now, we don't really have to look through this together, but you can kind of see it's really useful. Like I use this a lot, like just to help me understand like what components are in a code base and like what it's calling and what API calls it's making and stuff like that. So this is really cool. I've also added a lot of like stipulations here around like the color schema of this mermaid diagram and stuff like that because it does not look that good right off the bat. So this is pretty cool. I like this workflow a lot. Okay, now for the Figma, this one's the Figma cloning. So it's calling the Figma MCP server here. As you can see, it's calling the tool. And I'm also going to go into auto approve mode for this just so that we can kind of get through it a little bit quicker. And this one might take a while because it's actually going to require some setup for the tool and code generation. So it's going to try to install Vite. Sure. So we're just going to go through the flow. And okay, I'm gonna let this run autonomously. And then the last one, I'm also gonna go into YOLO mode just so we can get through this a little bit faster. Now, another thing I want to show off is if you're somebody who likes to parallelize a lot of workflows like I'm doing right now, we also have a multi-agent track on the top right. You can click this like rocket logo, I think. And essentially you can see all the different workflows I've kicked off. The check mark means that it's finished. So the transcription and the summarizing the code base have finished, as I've shown you. But the cloning the Figma repo or the cloning the Figma file and doing the GitHub to do issues, they're still running. So you can see that's marked by the purple dots here. So I really like this because I can kind of click into different workflows as they're running and kind of see like where in the process each agent is at, which is really nice. Okay. The next thing I'll show you is, so this one is the Figma file cloning. You can see that if I pop open any of these like little I don't know, like drop downs, you can see the code that's being generated. Now, just for the sake of this demo, I went into autonomous mode, which means that it's not really asking me to approve any of these as it goes, mostly because I just want to get through this faster. But if I was doing this on my own or just like without an audience watching, I would not have gone into auto mode. I would have approved, like I would have gone through the code and looked through everything that's happening. We also have uh, okay, it's not working. Not gonna show it. Okay. Ignore that. But yeah, I really like this because I can kind of see the code changes here. And I think it actually finished. So I'm actually excited to see how well it did on this. So let's go here and see. Okay. So just for reference, this is what it should look like approximately. Let's see what it did. Okay, cool. This is awesome. Oh shoot, that's pretty. I don't think this animation was in the. Oh, it was. Oh, it animated it. That's so cool. Oh my gosh. It's like did so much better than I thought it would do. Okay, nice. Okay. So you can see that I didn't show it in the prompt, but I did stipulate in the prompt something like, don't worry about any of the functionality, just get the UI correct. So you'll see if I actually click on any of the like buttons, it's not going to actually work. If I click on any of these like header buttons or anything like that, it's not going to link to anything, mostly because I told the agent not to worry about that. But you can see that it did what it was supposed to do really well, which is essentially be pixel perfect. It got like the text, the color schema, the spacing, like the entire template, all the icons and like graphics, like really well done. So yeah, this is awesome. Really impressed with this. Um, and then let's see the last one. So the last one is creating the GitHub issues, which I think it did correctly. Let me ask if it can you link me to each one? And again, you can see the MCP tool calls here. It's creating those GitHub issues for me. Okay, cool. Let's see if it did this right. Yeah, here we go. So I had a bunch of to-dos in my code base, and you can see it actually generated all the to-dos as GitHub issues for me, which are all linked here, so I can kind of go reference them or do whatever with them, which is really cool. And it should have all these as check marks. Well, maybe they're still running. But yeah, you can kind of see this is how I usually use Warp. I just run a bunch of different agents. Usually Warp executes on it pretty well if you prompt it correctly. A couple of optimizations you can do with like picking the right model and using rules and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, hopefully that was a helpful demo. This is like legitimately how I use Warp in my day to day. And I think that's my time. So let me know if there's any questions. And I hope that was interesting to watch.
That was super interesting, Jess. Thank you so much. There are a few questions from the attendees, so let me start with those, and then I have a few questions myself.
Okay.
So Sebastian had two questions. One is, are saved prompts a feature of Warp, or are you using MCP prompts provided by an MCP server?
They're a feature of Warp. So you can save prompts. You can also save environment variables. You can also save like terminal commands. Like I have a bunch of Docker commands saved in Warp. Yeah, they're a feature of Warp.
And then rules, that they reminded me a little bit of Claude skills as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like is that the kind of the idea that you can kind of define what happens in certain cases and the warp agent kind of picks up those rules dynamically?
Yeah, exactly. There's like different buckets of rules too. Like I have some rules that's like, oh, like I have this version of Next.js installed so that they like Warp knows that it doesn't that this is like the version I have. But then there's
Mhm.
also like if you've heard of like what's it called? Kiro hooks. Like basically you do an
Mm,
action and then Warp knows to kick something else off. So it's like if
I
I
see.
merge this pull request, I want you to kick off this process that reviews it for me or something
Mm,
like that. So there's different types of ways to use rules, but yeah, it's very similar to class skills in that sense. Yeah.
nice. And then Sebastian also asked, how granular is permission slash approval management in Warp? And
Yeah.
then, for example, Cursor has improved it a little bit. so that you can like waitlist or allow list individual commands, which is better than just like YOLO versus everything being manual.
Yep.
But yeah, what's the toggles that a developer has?
Yeah, so you can see my screen, right? Yeah, you can
Yep.
see warp. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we have a lot of like permissioning, granularity. So you can define your base model. You can define your planning model. So usually like base model, I kind of count as like the coding model, and then planning model is like the planning model. Um, I I also can create permissions around whether the agent decides to automatically apply code diffs to read files. I also have a directory allow list and command deny list. And then it also has like MCP servers. So whether or not you want to call certain MCP servers, also MCP allow list and deny list. It also has agent profiles. So you can see I have two agent profiles here. I have a YOLO agent profile, which essentially is like give them all the permissions, do whatever, don't care. And then I have a system architect agent profile, which plans a lot more. So you can create different profiles as well, which is really useful. Yeah.
Very useful. And then Dipti had a question around Figma, asking if it's Figma Design or Figma Make. And I'm guessing Figma Make is more for like uh, creating Figma specs directly, right? So this is more about the Figma MCP server being able to read the designs and then the Warp agent using them to create code.
Yeah, exactly. So this is Figma design, which is like imagine you're in a organization and you work with the designer and the designer gives you like a Figma file and you're like, "Oh, I just want to like quickly create a code base from this like in 10 minutes." That's like using the Figma MCP server to create code from the Figma design file. Figma Make, I don't know if you've used it, but it's like more like it's like you start with a prompt, like, oh, I want to create a website that has like a cookie monster eating cookies or something. And Make will just like design it for you and then also create the code behind it. So it's slightly different use cases. I would say Figma Make feels more like a Bolt or Lovable experience, to be honest,
Mm.
where you're kind of just, yeah, prompting some random thing and it just creates like the design and code for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. And then one question I had fundamentally was, so I showed you, for folks who are on the call, I showed Jess like my use of Warp, and I'm a heavy user of
Yeah.
Warp, and I have like probably a dozen different windows open with each with like a dozen different tabs. But like, how do you think about the autonomous mode and just like agent uh, authorization? Because you're also like, letting these agents do stuff in parallel. So like two questions on that. One is, do you ever let them operate on the same code base simultaneously? And secondly, like how do you think about auth in your day-to-day kind of like workflow for agents?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, which is like how do I think about auth? I think the main thing is like I've screwed up a couple of times and so I'm kind of learning from my own mistakes. But like there were times where I was using like the GitHub MCP, and when you use the GitHub MCP, you have to pass in your auth token.
Right.
And when I first did it, I just gave it all the permissions because I was just like, I don't want to spend time to figure out like what permissions to give it. And it did like I did essentially accidentally delete some stuff I wasn't supposed to. And like after that, I was like, oh shoot, okay, I have to think more about like giving it specifically only read only permissions for certain things. And I actually went through and read like what am I giving it permissions to? Um, and to be honest, I don't know. I assume there's probably some guide out there, which I haven't found yet. I'm just doing it more by trial and error, but I'm sure there's people who know a lot better than me. Um, so I'm not like the biggest expert in auth, but it's mostly just having I don't know, trial and error and being more like careful with what I do. In terms of working on the same code base, I know that's a problem that a lot of products are trying to solve right now. I believe Claude Code might have a solution for this, but I don't know. I don't use it
Mhm.
to work on the same code base, mostly because I know there's got to be some sort of product or feature support for that in terms of maybe like essentially forking a code base and allowing an agent to work on it and then merging it
Mhm.
essentially at some point. I don't think Warp or I know that Warp does not have product support for that yet, but we are working on that right now.
Hmm.
So don't use it for Warp, but I have a list of things I need to try out, and one of them is to see if I think that Cloud Code has some sort of feature around that. Is that correct? Do you know if like they have that feature? Some sort of like forking feature
Yeah.
thing.
So I think there are different ways of doing it. I think Rohit, you probably have some thoughts there too. But generally speaking, I think what people do is they either use like Git as the way of kind of branch management
Yeah,
for across the same code base. So you like do commits and different like agents can still operate in parallel, or they'll be really strict with the prompts for different sessions and be
yeah.
like, don't touch this part of the code
It's
base because they know that another agent is kind of like working on that. So that's like the state of the art that I know of. And then there's like background workers and background agents, but I think they still suffer the same kind of problems. Like each one of them will create like a separate branch and a pull request and
yeah.
everything. So parallel like things are basically like, use Git and don't trample on each other. That's the current state of the art.
Yeah, that feels very
Yeah.
manual,
Yeah.
but like maybe there'll be better support for it soon, like some sort of like one click button. Like some
Right.
can't do it, but um yeah, and then the only other thing is as I mentioned before, like philosophically I believe that like I don't believe in letting AI run autonomously a lot of the time. Like, I really like to review the code that it's generating. Um, or even if it's generating large chunks of code, I'll usually ask like it to tell me a summary of what it just created. Just because I think it's important to know generally like what it's doing, or at least to learn from like what AI is doing. So that's
Yeah.
just more of a philosophical thing that as I'm working with AI more and more, autonomous agents more and more. Yeah.
No, for sure. Well, I think that's a great segue into diving a little bit deeper into identity and auth as well. So thank you so much, Jess, for this fantastic demonstration of what like production grade agents look like.
Yeah,
And
thank
with that, I'd love to pass it on to Rohit.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, Jessica, great presentation. I haven't used Warp in a while. I used it like a year or two ago, and it's just crazy how much it's evolved, and it's really, really improved. So kudos. I'll share my screen for the presentation. So I want to start off just with a few slides talking about our approach to agentic identity, maybe some state of the art or like the meta in MCP auth, and then I'll dive into a quick demo of an authorized MCP server and what we're thinking about. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rohit. I work as an AI product manager at Descope. I joined about 2 months ago from Microsoft. Previously, I was at Microsoft working on Azure developer experiences. I got to work all over the place, like on the SDKs, on some of our coding agents, like GitHub Copilot for Azure. And then right before I left, or just pretty shortly after before I left, I started working on the MCP project at Microsoft and launched the Azure MCP server. I have a website. I guess I'll include that in the chat maybe, but um, I guess I'll dive right in since I want to be efficient with time. So thinking about agentic identity today, there's kind of like two levers you can have in terms of identity. And the main thing is there's obviously what you use to identify a certain agent or a certain user, but also there's these are important attributes to keep track of and as a part of policy management as well. Because there are, I think, in startup land, like at Descope compared to Microsoft, there's very different usage policies for what I can use and what I'm authorized to use, what those tools are authorized to access. So starting with the MCP client, there's kind of the client type, for example, that we can take a look at. Like I can look at ChatGPT specifically as an agent or Claude as an agent. That's part of the agentic identity. And then also there's the user. And this kind of pattern of agents today we call user consented, because usually what will happen is that an agent will try to do something. It'll prompt a consent flow or consent experience for the user. Like, do you authorize this app to have access to these resources? So that's what we call, at least at Descope, a user consented agent. And generally, it starts with a prompt to the agent, and it's a direct authorization request right after. So going into the user, of course, if I'm working within an enterprise or a company, There's details on the user's like roles that could be very helpful with determining policy and as a part of that agentic identity. So when I say there's two levers, those are kind of like two different areas where, depending on the client or depending on the user, you can start to enforce policy. So one question I get a ton is like, why is agent identity different than, for example, a user identity? And I think there's a whole lot of reasons, but I think I tried to summarize my main thoughts on this slide. The first thing is human scopes, for example. If I go to Google Calendar and it gives me write access means I can do anything on Google Calendar pretty much. I can edit meetings, create them, delete them, and so on. But that works for a human. But in the case of an agent, following the principle of least privilege, then agents are very task-based. So it may come down to be more granular than that. Maybe I want the agent to have the ability to update and create a meeting, but not delete them. And those kind of permissions are task-based as opposed to being scope-based, because those scopes are built for humans. So when you have a token, it's not simply just giving the token to the agent. There has to be some sort of, at least from Descope's perspective, there should be some sort of scoping given to the agent in terms of what it can actually do, using the tools or tasks that it's given. Additionally, agent identity lifecycles are, I'll just say, different. Depending on the actual session of how the agent's running, the lifecycles, the management, the entire process of an agent identity can vary a lot. And I think one point I really want to emphasize is that a lot of the way that we treat agentic identities so far has been driven by like giving access to resources, which is pretty much OAuth. Like, we're familiar with this problem, like an OAuth backed API, for example. But when we get into agents, there's a new interaction model where it's not just an application that has access to resources. There is a little bit more thinking that needs to happen in terms of access. So I believe that like when we started MCP server, when MCP popped off, it was like the servers are easy to build because they piggyback on traditional software engineering skills. And I can expose an MCP server very easily, especially with things like fast MCP and so on. But for building agents, there's a little bit more nuance in that. And there's a little bit more specialized skills. For example, like planning, the actual agent's planning, taking care of memory, and so on. These are more specialized skills that I think the industry will slowly catch up on. But however we evolve in terms of how we build agents, that's really going to define like the next wave of agent identity. I think that's one point I do want to make. And additionally, like going into the actual auditing, for example, if I'm an enterprise, I want to see every single action be audited. I want to have dashboards. I want to have huge databases or tables with so much information on what's being accessed when. And agent intentions are delegated, and there's kind of a new compliance problem that emerges when you think about who's directly responsible for something an agent does, if it was authorized or not. So this is why I really think that agent identity is a new field, and it definitely piggybacks on existing identity principles, but there are new problems and new considerations that we just haven't had in the prior. So this is kind of a slide showing like the meta of MCP Auth today, like what's considered the spec. It ignores the lower level protocol details, but these are kind of the high level players that you might have. So we'll start on the left side. Can you see my cursor by any chance when I move it around?
Yep.
Oh, yes. Cool. So on this left side, we have what we call the agentic identity, right? There's the user actually interacting with an MCP client, and then the MCP client itself. Then, for example, if I have an MCP server, the MCP client can go there directly. And the first time it connects, it'll just try and waltz its way in. The MCP server will be like, hey, hold on, you're unauthorized. Go check with my authorization server to get some sort of permissions, and then come back. So there's the MCP server, and there's the authorization server, which handles client registration and all the OAuth, OIDC steps, the things that I'm sure everyone loves to deal with. But the one important thing to note is that there's kind of like two credentials to worry about. And that's kind of at the heart of how we're solving, or how we think about this agentic identity and permissioning and access and so on. There's first the actual access to the MCP server, and then there's these credentials that are needed to talk to either OAuth enabled APIs or APIs based on API keys, or even like sometimes a third-party MCP server if you have one talking to another, which that is a use case which I've surprisingly seen. So regardless of all of this, there's kind of this like token, there's this middleman in terms of token issuance, because again, these tokens are these tokens or API keys come designed for humans. which may not correlate to the actual tool level permissions that we want to have for an agent. So there is that's kind of how we're looking at this problem, where again, the agent is task-based. So how can we issue some sort of access level at the task level for the agent? So I'll go more into the authorization server part, since that's kind of what Descope does. And I'll talk specifically about client registration, because this is a very interesting problem. Essentially, in client registration, this is an application getting access to your resources. So before agents, the most common way for this to, or for a client to get access to resources, is the OAuth client credentials flow. And the way this works is a user would go into a UI like a console or so on. They would generate a client ID or client secret for an app, and then I would grab those values and then go back to something like Claude Desktop and go copy paste those in. And while this works for smaller agent use cases, if I ever want to have a if I ever want to open up my MCP server to the world, this might not be the way to do, because there's a lot of manual work required, and it just doesn't scale very well. It's a lot of effort required for manual configuration of client ID and client secret. So that led to something more dynamic, which is dynamic client registration. And this is kind of where we're at today. This is the solution we've landed on for now. If you're familiar with MCP auth, it started off with no auth, and then it went to, okay, roll your own auth in the MCP server. And then now we're in the world where you can have an authorization server do this for you. But we're here with dynamic client registration. And the way it works is the client will go to the authorization server. It'll get some metadata, specifically with details on registration. I don't know if I can zoom in, or maybe not, but can everyone see that? It's a little small. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's
cool.
It's passable.
Okay, I'll take passable. Thank you. So yeah, the agent the client will receive a metadata document that has details on the registration endpoint, and then it will go to that registration endpoint. And there's these optional steps, which I'll touch on later. But in general, it will take that information from the register endpoint. It will post to it with client metadata and the access token if that's enforced. And then the authorization server validates all of that and issues a client ID and client secret. And then now you can do your standard OAuth or OIDC, where it would pop up a consent screen and everything, now that you've registered a client. But this happens as a part of the client first going to the MCP, or going to the authorization server to register. So from a scalability perspective, this is really nice, because you don't have to manually configure the client ID, client secret anymore. The agent can kind of know to just go ahead and do that. But this does come with a few risks, which I'll touch on. First, when you do dynamic client registration, this register endpoint that's given to the client to go to post to, it's open to any client. So any client on the internet could potentially post to this endpoint, which leads to a whole lot of security risks, like malicious IPs or bad MCP clients and so on. There's a lot of security risk here. Another thing is authorization is hard to enable, because there's only so much client information that you get when the client goes through dynamic client registration. And the reason why it's not suggested as the long-term solution mainly is because it requires the identity provider, like a Descope or so on, to have extra hardening of this step. Like the steps of, for example, blocking IP traffic or only allowing certain MCP clients, that has to fall on the identity provider. And that's a lot of features to ask for that probably could live in a protocol or some sort of overall decision on how we do client-side verification of how we do verification of an MCP client. So that brings in the next proposal, which is kind of the next state of MCP auth. And this is client ID metadata documents. So this is the specification enhancement proposal 991, if you want to go look that up on the MCP repo. But essentially what this is the client is now responsible for hosting a metadata document on an HTTPS URL. And the idea is that since it's an HTTPS URL, there's some added level of security to this metadata document that's being hosted. And what happens now is that the client gets its metadata document and passes that in as the client ID. Then the authorization server will go there, check the metadata. It will get all of the different values, for example, the name, the redirect URIs, and so on. And then it will initiate that consent screen depending on what it sees. And the nice thing here is that the client can connect to an authorization server with all of the information that it wants in hand. The only challenge here is that the client is now required to host this metadata document. So if I'm doing a web-based client, for example, it could work really well because I have already a backend where I could just put an extra file, right? Like a JSON can live. But if I'm doing something like a desktop client, now I'm required to have an HTTPS hosted client metadata document. So it actually doesn't solve the problem entirely, but it solves it a lot more. And if you're curious, here's what an example of a CIMD or client ID metadata doc would look like. And for an authorization server like Descope, this is like a gold mine. This gives us a lot of details on the incoming client, which we can use to enforce policies. So it's kind of a win-win for both, or it's a win for the authorization provider, but from an agent builder perspective, to actually have this and follow the latest standards in security, there's some extra work required of hosting this document. But I can take in different items like the client name, for example. I can also look at redirect URIs. I can also look at the URI itself to identify the agent that's coming in. And then that gives us an identity, at least from the application itself that's connecting to our MCP server. So it's an improvement. It's coming out in the next MCP spec. I think if you're building agents, it's something to take a look at, especially if you're building agents for compliant workflows. And this is my last slide that kind of goes back on why I think the evolution of agent identity will come from the agent side. I think, like I said before, the current OAuth mechanisms that we have today can be good enough for today's agents. Like DCR can work if provided that the identity provider has some sort of hardening on its side. But the interaction model has, as it goes more autonomous, that really changes a lot of things. And just some new challenges that I'm thinking of, that we're thinking about at Descope are. The first one is, if I have a local host agent or a desktop client, and there isn't a hosted client ID metadata doc, how do I know I can trust it? That brings into things like software statements or like OS level attestation. And there's a whole bunch of ideas that are floating around in the space, but how do we actually trust local agents? You know, for example, Cursor, they could probably host a client ID metadata document as even if they're a local host agent. But if you're a smaller agent or agent builder, or maybe you don't have that at hand, or if you want to run an agent locally on a custom OpenAI agents SDK, for example, in your machine, that might be seen as an untrusted agent now in the future. So how do we actually trust that? That's one thing that we're looking at or thinking about. Another thing is, especially as agents go into the background and start doing background tasks, this is why I keep mentioning the interaction model. Like if it's just chatbot based, it's pretty straightforward. We have OAuth mechanisms for that. But what if an agent's running in the background for 2, 3, 4 hours, comes back with a request to create a pull request on GitHub? How does that client-initiated authorization request come into play? Additionally, the last thing that we're thinking about, and I think what a lot of identity providers are thinking about, is cross-domain identity assertion, meaning we have this solution in place in Descope. We take care of that with our proprietary solution for if an agent has this token that we've given it, can we map the scopes in that token to the actual human scopes so it can execute the tool or it can execute the tool? The idea with cross-domain identity assertion is that if an agent comes in with a certain token, there's already some expectation on the other side, for example, like a Google or HubSpot, on what that token can access. Which, in my opinion, it's an interesting problem, but I think there needs to be new scopes or needs to be some sort of specialized work that goes into this. This is a problem called, or this is a space called IDJAG, which a lot of people are talking about. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen since that was my last slide. But I do want to talk about or show a quick demo of Descope and an agent. So let me get back and share my desktop one. Cool. So I have a Claude here, and I'll connect it to my custom Descope demo MCP server. Let's see. Waiting for this. And there we go. We have a custom consent screen that's added that allows the agent to do certain things. And then Descope, we also support optional scopes. So if I don't want my agent to read HubSpot data, I can uncheck that. And then when I click authorize, it'll ask me for a specific API key from HubSpot. If I have one, I can just skip this since it is an optional scope. And then I can log in here, allow access to my Google Calendar. And then I can send myself back to Claude. How do I go back to chat from this UI?
It's pretty confusing. I think you click the sidebar on the besides settings. It's very confusing UI.
Okay, cool.
There we go.
All right. So I have this MCP client connected to my MCP server, which is authorized with Descope. I have a few details on my identity now within the Descope console. So I have my user, or I have my app that's been configured, which is here. And when that whole registration process happened via DCR, again, it kicks off the, it tried to go to the MCP server directly. MCP server said, go check in with Descope. Then it went to the authorization server and it kicked off the consent screen that we saw. So now that's registered. Actually, we have the ability to label this based on the redirect URI that we identified during dynamic client registration. And they have some existing scopes. And again, this one is not mandatory. And I can go in the consents here and I can see that there's an associated user. And that associated user is actually me. So I already copied this and gone into my users field and within Descope, and I can see my different roles. So I have the role of viewer here. And what that means is I have a configured Google Calendar. Oops. I have a configured Google Calendar, which has access depending on the incoming user roles. So if the user role contains viewer, then my accessible scope is, it's hard to see, but it's let me edit this. It is calendar read only. But if I have a scheduler role, then I'll just get all the scopes, which essentially is just, I think it's just literally called Google Calendar. So with this, we can enforce some sort of human-based role access as well as the agent-based. Another thing that we talked about was like how DCR is a little bit sketchy sometimes. So one thing that Descope has is the ability to do an assessment flow. And this is our flows product, which essentially makes all of our consent screens and so on no code if you'd like. So you can edit all of these based on just conditional statements. You can execute some code and so on. But that allows us to run a policy here. And I can look in the redirect URI field directly. And if I see it contains something like Claude AI, I can explicitly call that out as agent is Claude. Or if I allow local host agents, if I see the redirect URI points to a local host or Cloudflare or so on. And then from there, I can have, I can mark apps as verified or unverified, and then I can apply policies like only verified apps can access this or so on. So that's the, I guess, the agent lever that we can pull for agentic identity enforcement. So if I try and say something like, go back to my client and say, schedule a meeting on October 29th at 3 p.m. ET with Kevin at descope.com titled test. I've already connected the MCP server, I believe. Oh, I haven't even turned it off. Oops. Or I haven't even turned it on. 1 second. There we go. I have the Zoom thing in the way. Why is this not connected?
I wonder if you need to refresh your Claude desktop. I think sometimes it.
Let's try. I'm not a Claude Power user, but it's can I turn this on? No, I cannot. Let me try and disconnect and reconnect it. Let's see.
I feel like I should insert some joke here about how Warp can do it without.
Yeah, I will say this is on the client side. I hate to throw Anthropic under the bus here, but
this is a cool demo though.
Yeah,
I've got to try this out.
So let's see. Is this connected now? Okay, cool.
Nice.
So I have this meeting here, and I can ask the agent to execute this tool. And so it'll identify, you know how MCP works. It'll identify the create calendar event, and then it will run the tool. But there's an access issue because although it has access to this tool on the MCP server side, it actually doesn't have I don't have the scheduler role applied within Descope. So what I can do is go into my users. I remember we have this only viewers can, or only the viewer role can view. And then if you have the scheduler role, you can do read and write access. So I can go into my users, can find myself. I can go and edit. And again, this is manual, but you can also have this be like an automated process as well. You can add scheduler, hit save, and then let's try it again. And sometimes Claude is a little bit smart. It won't try and use the tool again because it recognized it failed the first time, but let's just go ahead and test this. Hoping this one works. Sometimes it takes a while to propagate roles as well, just standard role-based access. Cool. And there we go. It actually got to create the meeting now. So we can see that there's like multiple levers that we can control on the agent identity itself, either about the user or the agent itself. And that's pretty much the demo, just showing off what authorization looks like at an MCP server.
That's super, super cool. I think a lot of folks have a bunch of questions, including me. So I'll go first.
Sure.
So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, and you touched upon this, is what's the identity that the agent should assume? Should it basically inherit the scopes and permissions of like Rohit, the person who is invoking the agent, or should it be like its own service user that's configured in a particular way? So maybe like if you could start with that on like, what's your opinion on how this should go?
Yeah, I think for now, with today's agents, it makes a lot of sense to be user associated and kind of inherit a subset of what the user can do. I think that from an enterprise standpoint, that's like it enforces all the least privilege and whatever they're looking for. So I think that's a good place to start. I think where this would change, and you mentioned service level, which is where if agents become more autonomous, they might have to have their own identities on their own. And then if they are working and they need authorization, like I said, there's a need for MCP to be able to support some sort of client initiated authorization upgrade, authorization downgrade, or so on, depending on how the agent is running. So in short, I think today's agents are fine with being user associated, but I think really the next generation of identity will evolve as agents become more like hands off or in the background.
That makes sense. And then the other thing you touched on very early was like this idea that in permissioning should be task-based and not just scope-based. And I'm curious, like, how far can we stretch that for agents? Like in this case, you give access to like the Google Calendar scheduling permissions to Rohit, the user, and by association to the agent that you invoked. But can it be like you're only allowed to schedule meetings under certain conditions, which are more like task oriented? How far can we push these like rules and policies for these agent workloads?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think we try and go as granular as the tool level. So that we can have custom policies set within an MCP server on the actual tools that are there. And what that would look like is when I'm adding an MCP server to Descope, I can either import or I can add my scopes for each tool manually. And then that gives me another option to be able to tweak and say, and these agents, like salespeople who using Glean can use like the Salesforce MCP tools or something like that. So that level of user, agent, and then now at a tool level, what that access looks like. So we're thinking at a tool level of granularity.
That makes sense. And then Sebastian has a couple of questions. So one is, how is Descope as an auth server different from the traditional auth server providers like Auth0, Okta, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, Descope competes in the same markets as those companies. So my short answer is we're better. I'm kidding. The emphasis of Descope is in kind of two main ways. The flows is what I showed, where it really makes managing consent journeys in like a low code format. But in terms of the actual functionality, I'd say the same. And we have like a few features like the DCR hardening, the agent labeling, and so on. That's a little bit more ahead, but generally they'll do the same task for that you'd want.
Okay. And then how can clients, like this is, I think, referring to the local desktop examples that you had, host an HTTPS URL containing the metadata document?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like a client like Cursor, there is a backend. They do have files hosted there. So essentially they would just have to host it on whatever Cursor's backend is. And it's a tall order for agent builders. So I think there is going to be like some sort of update to making it so local agents can assert themselves in a certain way, and we can trust that. But yeah,
Right.
essentially it's like there has to be a backend that exists, and the files have to live there is the short answer. So and that has to
Yeah.
expose a URL.
If I had to guess the answer to that, like MCP, and I think Sebastian mentioned this. By the way, Sebastian, thank you for asking excellent questions throughout.
Great questions. Yeah.
One of the things he also mentioned was that MCP was originally designed to run as a sidecar next to your local LLM application, like Claude Desktop or Claude Code. And now they're clearly like remote first is kind of like the way to go, is seems to be the direction that the spec is headed as well. And my guess is that the answer would probably be that if you're running it locally, that like auth is, you can kind of get away with like not implementing auth in the same way because you have more control over what you're running locally. I personally disagree with that in general, but like I think that's my guess onto how the spec is evolving a little bit as well.
Yeah. And like I said, they are exploring some ways to make client assertion more of a reality, but you can see the prioritizations clearly going towards remote servers at the moment.
Right.
And I saw that I just opened up the Q&A, so I saw the last sentence. Is this meant as a feature catering to enterprises? And yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like as organizations adopt MCP, they're going to have different levels of trust. I at Microsoft, I was always taught to try and make every single dev tutorial be possible for someone who can't install Node.js. Like how do you
Yeah.
go on from there? That level of like tight control. So
Right.
that's kind of for CIMD. I think that would definitely be that'd be one of the features, especially as it rolls out initially, that enterprises would look for. Maybe you can get away with it if you have like a smaller company or trust your
Yeah.
employees a little bit more.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Rohit. That was phenomenal, and a really good discussion, and also very. I think there are also more questions than answers at the moment because of like where we are in the space, which is a really great conversation topic. And so thank you for kind of like eliciting that discussion. Let me spend a few more minutes. I know we are like an hour in, but I want to spend maybe 10 more minutes talking a little bit more about Auth from the MCP kind of like agent perspective. And so maybe like what I want to focus on is this diagram that folks can see on the right-hand side, which is we've been really thinking about like agents as MCP servers. That's what MCP agent does, is it exposes the agents that you build as servers themselves, because that lets you like use those agents in any MCP client. And but like when it comes to auth, there is an added kind of like issue that comes up, because now you can imagine that like the MCP client is connected to your agent as a server, but then that agent may be connected to other MCP servers that it needs to do its job. So like Jess showed GitHub and Figma, and so imagine having like the Warp agent or something be exposed as an MCP server, and it still needs to authenticate with Figma and GitHub and so forth. And so like, how does auth work in that case? And that's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And then obviously like, how do you authorize the agent server itself in the first place? So I have two things I want to show on those fronts. So one is just the simple case, which is the auth server itself. For that Rohit, you also showed like Descope has one, and in this case we have one for MCP Agent Cloud as well. So in this case, like when you connect to your agent server, you're redirected to basically an auth server, and then you authenticate there using, in this case, like Google or GitHub. You grant it certain permissions. Those scopes and permissions, again, we talked a little bit about, they're associated with the user identity, the person who is authenticating the agent. And then once you authorize, you have access to like that MCP server. So at this point, we are like in the first part of this, which is now we have the agent server authenticated. But then like you can imagine that, this agent now needs to use GitHub or something. So how do you authenticate that downstream? And so before I show like a quick demo, the thing that MCP has another spec update for that is still under pull request like review, but I think we'll make it through, is this idea of URL-based elicitation. And so elicitation is already part of the spec. Elicitation in the simpler case basically means, let's say like a client requests a tool call being made from a server. the server during the process of the tool call can actually pause the tool call and request something back from the client. So this, you can imagine, like human in the loop style workflows. It's really important, right? Like, let's say you ask a booking agent, like, please book a hotel reservation for me for like Wednesday at 5 p.m. And as that server tool call happens, you realize that like Wednesday at 5 p.m. is unavailable, but the agent is like, oh, how about Thursday at 7 p.m. or something like that. So in that case, you would create, the server tool would basically pause, and you would create an elicitation request, which goes back to the client and gets surfaced to the user. The user provides their input, and then that goes back to the server, and the server will continue processing that tool call. Similarly, now there is this idea of a URL-based elicitation request, which is meant for authorization workflows. So in this case, like the example I had here, let's say your agent now needs to, which is already connected to your MCP client as a server, now needs to connect to a GitHub MCP server, so like a third-party MCP server. So it's like a two-hop kind of step. So in that case, during the agent's tool call, it's going to need to authorize, and URL-based elicitation is meant for use cases like that, where then that server could create an elicitation request, and as part of the elicitation request, it can provide like the auth URL to kind of go to in order to kind of authorize and authenticate. And then that URL is like basically a consent form is shown to the user. The user provides that consent, and then that URL is open directly. And that's where like basically the third party like GitHub knows, okay, this user is now authorized, and we can proceed with the like agent's request. And so the idea is that like you'll be able to use this to authenticate like multi-hops even of like MCP connections, but do it in a safe way where this in between agent does never sees like the GitHub credentials, because it's never passing them back through. That like GitHub MCP server can actually be like giving the authorization URL directly that the client sees and then authorizes against. So this is like where things are headed. We don't have this yet, but we have kind of implemented a version of this in MCP agent. And so you can actually use this already today in MCP agent. So let me open my code. So I have this, this is all in the GitHub repo, by the way, in MCP agent. So this one would be under examples OAuth. And in this case, what I have is a server that connects to the GitHub MCP server itself. So this server creates like has a tool that does something agentic, and in turn, that tool will call a GitHub MCP server. And in this flow, I can actually specify the OAuth credentials. This is the stuff that Rohit showed. So like I can configure the client ID and the scopes and all of those things. In fact, as a configuration here, including like callback URLs and so forth. And then at auth time, those would be that is what would be used to kind of like authenticate the GitHub MCP server. And then the client side is pretty simple. This one will just connect to my like the server that I just created and try to like call it. And so let's just run this real quick. And I think I already signed in, so it may not actually like trigger the auth, but it should open my browser. So here first I'm going to run my server. So this is my agent server. This is my MCP agent application that's being served on like localhost 8000 as an MCP server. And then I'll run the client that connects and tries to like do something with this agent. And as part of like calling that, you can actually see that it opened my browser, it authenticated, and that's when it like actually made the tool call. Like it's trying to make the search repositories tool call. It like finds the available tools on GitHub MCP, and it as part of like the process of findings of connecting to the GitHub server is when it like created that browser challenge and made me like kind of interact with this. In this case, I've already like done this, so that's why it didn't show me like the login screen. But that's the idea, that like you should be able to log in and provide your credentials for the different services and tools that your agent is using. And so the very last thing I wanted to show you is a lot of this is actually available now in this cloud platform that we've been building, and would love your feedback on. It's called MCPC. The C stands for the second C stands for cloud. And the idea is that you should be able to like host your agents as MCP servers, we want to provide a safe environment for agent execution. So think of this as like kind of the deployment and runtime environment for any kind of MCP server, especially agents. And then it also provides like a very simple OAuth kind of like authorization server for the MCP server, so you can authorize that pretty easily, as well as like configure your custom OAuth settings for the different servers that you use in your agent itself. And really the idea is that everything is like exposed as an MCP server here. And so there's like pretty much no custom API other than the model context protocol. And it supports the entire MCP spec. So like sampling, elicitation, notifications, logging, and obviously tools, resources, prompts, pretty much like basically every single API that MCP supports is supported in the cloud platform. And so, yeah, you can pretty much get started today. We're really looking for feedback. And so you can just go to like docs.mcpagent.com and get started. And I think the quick start, literally you run a few commands, and the last thing that you do to get what I just showed you working is you do a UVX MCP agent login and then UVX MCP agent deploy, and you get kind of like a working MCP agent server. And this, like I mentioned, works for like agents. It works for MCP servers, and it also works for ChatGPT applications, which for folks who are familiar with it, have been exposed as MCP servers in the under the covers with some custom UI settings. So I'll pause there. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see if there are questions and comments and whatnot. But Rohit, go ahead.
Yeah, this seems like we're getting into A2A versus MCP territory. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh man. So I think protocols are only as useful as their adoption. And I think I'm very confident in MCP being adopted. And also, like you said earlier, the level of granularity that we're operating on is the tool call level, because like everybody's thinking of auth and all of those things from the perspective of tools. We think agents can also be modeled as tool calls. Like in order to invoke an agent, you can make a tool call. In order for an agent to invoke another agent, that agent can make a tool call. And so then like right there, you have like a multi-agent interaction. So that's what like our opinion is right now. I also am hopeful that the MCP spec, just like it's evolving for auth, is also going to evolve for agents. And so we're actually going to see more first party support for agent workflows on MCP itself. I'm still open to other protocols. I am not picky about this, but I'm just seeing where like the adoption is and where the mass kind of like adoption in the market is. And MCP definitely has it. Like every customer we work with is thinking of like building MCP services for their like infrastructure, but almost nobody we talk to is doing the same for A2A. People have exactly that question, but they haven't like invested that time yet. So that's just like our opinion is, how do we like push MCP to the limits where it can itself be able to host agent workflows? But yeah, I'm curious if you have opinions on this.
No, it kind of echoes what I feel. I mean, I think the reason why I mentioned is because I think it's definitely something that a lot of people listening would think about,
Yeah,
especially given the kind of MCP was like initially the tool definition, right? And now we're evolving into a
right.
more holistic agent, multi-agent or multi-workflow connection protocol. I think it makes a lot of sense. And actually, I kind of appreciate the natural growth of it versus just saying, I don't know, A2A for me feels like it was trying to define this problem before we really had agents talking to other agents. And I feel like
Exactly.
MCP feels
Yeah.
more native to the problem. So I
Yeah.
share the same consensus on it.
Nice. Yeah, I think I completely agree. So we'll let that rest until somebody else stirs the pot with yet another protocol that comes out maybe. Um, and Sebastian asked, is this elicitation auth flow meant for cases where we dynamically add MCPs during an agentic trace, or meant for general case usage where the MCP servers are known at the time the agent is kicked off? So it's I think for both actually. So there are cases where it's like you may connect to an MCP server dynamically, and then like at that point you kind of authorize and authenticate. The example I showed is that example where it's happening dynamically. Even though the agent is like has access to the GitHub MCP, it didn't actually like uh, do the authorization until it needed that GitHub MCP server. And then there are other cases, like I think where actually the thing that Rohit showed earlier, where in his Claude desktop, he like configured and authorized the Descope MCP demo server. In that case, it was like, at the time when before we actually hit the like called Claude, it was for at the configuration time of Claude desktop itself. And so those are both of those things I think would involve the elicitation auth. But I think elicitation is more meant for the dynamic case because it's like in the flow of a tool call that elicitation gets invoked. Hope that answered your question, Sebastian. Cool. So that's all I had. And I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who stuck around a little longer to kind of see the end of all the demos. Also, a huge thank you to Jess and to Rohit for an amazing set of presentations. I really enjoyed this and I actually learned a whole bunch. Like Hania mentioned in chat, we have our next event coming up just in 3 weeks' time. We do this every 3 weeks. We'll have a bunch of great speakers then as well. But please just like give us feedback on MCP Cloud as well. MCP Agent, you can just like Google that and it'll take you to MCP Cloud docs as well. And yeah, until next time. So thank you, everybody. Really, really nice chatting.
Thanks all.